Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to something in season 3 of Man Buns and Jesus. I don't think I don't. We're not going to put an episode number on this one because it's a break from what we have been doing, and Ben's going to tell you about that. We'll call this a really long hot take that will be released as a regular episode. But my name is Josh Laborious. I'm a pastor in Eastvale, California, and the other voice with me this morning is the esteemed Reverend Benjamin Olschlager, first of his name. How are we doing today, Ben?
We're doing all right. It's been a busy week in the Olschlager household, and getting ready to go out of town for a little bit here. Um, but because of some of the logistical things that have come up in my life, we are taking a couple weeks here to step away from our Corinthians series and do kind of like a mini series within the season on something that's been, I don't want to say like, it's just something that's flared up in the last couple of weeks as a quote unquote issue. For those of you who do not follow the idiosyncrasies of church politics and rage monsters on social media,
So, all
uh,
of you, hopefully.
yeah, God bless you if you know what we're talking about or know why we're talking about what we're talking about today, um, or for the next couple of weeks, excuse me. Um, about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, Concordia Publishing House released a annotated version of the Large Catechism with a number of essays written to help provide application on some of Luther's teaching and how we can bring it into the modern day. Um, Much of that work was met with lots of applause and is already being kind of quoted and used in various applications. Um, but a handful of essays within the book received some pretty sharp pushback. Um, and it got to the point where um, like larger Christians out on the story, and President Harrison even took the step to ask CPH pause publication of uh, the catechism so that they could examine the complaints and make sure that they were not something that had been missed in the review process that documents that our publishing house, Concordia Publishing House, puts out um, through its regular channels. So they did. They took about 48 hours, looked at some of the complaints, went, we don't think there's anything to this, and re-released it for publication. At which point, Josh and I immediately bought it because uh, we're suckers for controversy, and we wanted to know what was going on. Um, I hope that's not an unfair portrayal of what happened.
I don't.
um,
Doesn't paint us in a great light, but you know.
I'm trying to be honest here. But in broader reality, we wanted to know, what people were upset about because the loud and immediate response that happened in social media and in other places um, is kind of a microcosm of what some people in our pews experience as they think about and study theology. So it's worth us, taking a look at some of the controversy and trying to figure out, what to make of it. Um, so we bought the catechism. We read the articles in question. There were like three or four that really kept getting cited around social justice and um, sexuality and a couple of other things. Um, But this week and next week, we're going to take a look at the two issues that were probably the most cited among all of the complaints. Um, One had to do with gender and sexuality, and specifically, the complaint was made that the LCMS as a whole, by releasing this document, was taking way too soft a stance on issues of gender and sexuality. Um, and two, the the episode that we're going to release a week from now, as you're listening to this, um, there were a lot of complaints around the issue of self defense. What does the Bible say about defense and self defense? And uh, as Christians, what should we be thinking about it? Josh and I have already covered these topics on the podcast, at least in
Well,
some.
have we covered self-defense? Have we done that many episodes that I'm forgetting them?
I think we did one on self defense. We may not have. Josh is going to fact check me now because I
I'm
was
just
90% certain that we have done something either on self defense or just war or use of force or something. Um,
I think we've done something tangential to it.
but
Or it might be one of those topics that has like come up in our like brainstorming a dozen times, but we've never followed through on it.
fair. Um,
Um, we talked about war.
that was probably the one I'm thinking about because
Yeah, yeah, I think that would be the closest.
okay. So I guess we haven't gone into a ton of depth on self defense and the Christian position on self defense. Um, but what we're going to do today, and what we're going to do next week. Um, and if you watch these episodes on YouTube, you'll notice that we don't change between episodes. And that's because we're recording these on the same day and releasing them over 2 weeks. But what we're going to do is we're going to not necessarily look at the controversies themselves, especially with the sexuality one, because we've already spent an episode talking about a lot of this stuff. But we want to kind of peel back the layers of some of the cultural forces that cause us to react the way that we do around some of these issues. Um, and hopefully give you as our listener here a a framework or an opportunity to reflect um, on where your suppositions might be coming from. That's an ACT word or SAT word, depending on what part of the country you come from. That just means like, what is your background telling you about a certain subject? Um, and if we're able to kind of understand where we're coming from and acknowledge that there are other contexts in the world we live in, that might help us in some of these discussions to be more Christian, to be more honest, to be more caring, as we talk with brothers and sisters in Christ about some really delicate and controversial issues. So, Josh, did I miss anything?
No, the only things I just want to throw out there for any of our listeners who are less in tune with the Lutheran world, or just like a couple definitions. Concordia Publishing House is like the official uh, publishing company for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Um, they put out all of our stuff, and part of the thing with that is everything that they publish undergoes something called doctrinal review, which means they get a bunch of really smart people who are really familiar with their theology to double check, to triple check the book to make sure that from beginning to end, it is consistent with what we believe. So when Ben talks about the review that it went through, it wasn't just checking for comma splices and periods in the right places, right? They went over this already with a fine-tooth comb. And in fact, our synodical president, who is like a lot of the people who were getting upset on the internet tend to align with our synodical president. he gave it his stamp of approval prior to publication. Like he wrote a glowing review of the text. So there's all that.
Yeah, and it's not like even within that review process, like the fine tooth comb is a good analogy because I've spoken to a few people who've written for CPH or Concordia Publishing House. We're going to refer to it as CPH from here on out because we don't want to have to say Concordia Publishing House for the rest of the episode.
These are facts.
Um, but I know some people who've written for CPH, and all of them are annoyed by the review process because of how long it takes, how thorough some of these people are. Um, I know some of them take a lot of pride in finding the smallest thing to write to CPH about. Um, some of which may not be helpful, but it means that a lot of the work that comes out of there, you can have real confidence that like it's not going to throw something wildly false at you.
Yes. It's not, it's probably not even going to throw something moderately false at you.
Yeah, there's some
So
fluff
that,
around the edges, but other than that,
yeah, yeah. So I want to throw two
good
things
stuff.
out there for all of our listeners. First, there is the conspiracy theory part of me that says this controversy, quote unquote, was manufactured to sell more books. Like when I saw it, when I read it, I was like, I mean, at very least, CPH sold 2 more copies of this book because of this controversy. Because I don't know about you, Ben, I would not have made this purchase if there hadn't been an issue around it. I wouldn't have bought it.
I might have just because I like so many of the authors that contributed articles.
Okay, that's so we'll call it. They got 1.5 extra sales at very least because.
I
So
think like
now that
half.
I've said that suspicious thing about CPH, like their stuff is good. From a like, if you are looking and you want to learn something more about theology, getting CPH material is, if you're going to go through it by yourself, I would encourage you to use CPH material because you know it's in the right place theologically, right? Like when people are talking to me at our church about buying curriculum or buy, my first step is frequently CPH because if it comes from somewhere else, I have to look at it first and I have to check it first to make sure it's clear and maybe even have to change some things, which I am happy to do. But if you just want something that out of the box, I can be like, yes, I'm sure that's fine. Out of the box is good, theologically speaking. Go to CPH, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so with that, let's step into the article. And I think so. I got,
Let's.
and
I want
what do you want
to
to do?
remind people where we're headed here. This these next couple episodes might be a little bit in the weeds, but we hope that we can make them practical for you. Because this catechism was written mostly with pastors in mind. Some more
Really?
educated or interested lay people. Yeah, it was written mostly for people who wanted to know a lot more about like deeper levels of theology.
Huh.
Um,
I feel like the 6 articles I
and
read were really approachable.
I mean, a lot of them are because, especially for those topics, like these are relatively new issues within the church, and so I think we're still kind of building from the ground up a little bit. Um, but those also are meant to speak to people who are in specific contexts and in specific places, and they may not be wholly applicable in every sense to all people,
There's the episode's
if that
disclaimer.
makes sense.
Um,
Yep,
we good? We ready to move?
I think
Move
we're
in?
good. Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, talking
So
talking human sexuality.
Yeah, I have to be, and I texted Ben because we did all this prep yesterday, and we read through the articles. And I read through, so the issue is around the sixth commandment, which is don't commit adultery, right? That's what we're dealing with, um, and all of the forms that that takes. And I read these three articles, and I genuinely could not. I couldn't even figure out which one was the quote unquote issue. Because I read through all three of them and I'm like, there's nothing controversial here. Like, there's nothing that should be mind boggling. And so I'm pretty sure I figured it out. I think the article that caused the stir was an article by a guy named Stephen N. Lee. I don't know who that is. Um, doesn't really matter. I'm going to weigh it based on the ideas that he puts out, not who he is. And the title of the article is Encouragement for Christians with Gender Dysphoria and Homosexual Attraction. And I could see where if you are let's call them blogging inclined Lutherans, the bloggerly inclined, and you didn't read the book, you just saw the heading, I could see where you would be like, oh, that's a problem. We shouldn't be encouraging these things. Read the article because I think it's actually very helpful. And there are four things I want to draw our attention to in the article. The first is this. He says, how then can Christians help people who experience gender dysphoria, the sense that one is not the sex of one's body, or who are homosexually attracted to others? So when we're talking about encouragement, we're talking about how can we help people who deal with this stuff. And he goes on to say, too many Christians see them as only as challenged spiritually and as tempted to despise and doubt God. And certainly many people with gender dysphoria or homosexual attraction deny God's creating work. Yet some are brothers and sisters in Christ striving to lead godly lives. The temptation is to ignore these brothers and sisters in Christ who are enduring the daily confusion and misery of gender dysphoria, or who are fighting and repenting of homosexual sin. Our response starts with genuine love for Christians with these experiences. And then this is a little bit later on the same page. It says, today's culture seems focused, even obsessed, with the search for sexual identity, demanding that each person answer, quote, am I gay, straight, bisexual, transgender, or something else? End quote. But when it comes to identity, what matters most is our baptismal identity, what God says we are, not what we think we are. It is better to look at him, not ourselves. And I read this and I'm like this is exactly what we're supposed to be doing, right? We recognize that people struggle with this kind of stuff, and just because you don't doesn't mean that it's not a real struggle for them. Uh-huh. And then he gives, and like if you read, there's a book that I think was assigned at the seminary at some point called The Gay Gospel, ? And this is the primary thing. It says the best way to handle stuff like this is to point people back. Your identity is not in your sexuality. Your identity is in your baptism. Your identity is in the fact that God says you are someone he created and loved. And I think people read this, and Ben, I'm sure you're going to pick up on this in a minute, but in our society, we have been so trained to always look for the question underneath the question. So we see certain keywords, we see certain buzzwords, we see different things, and we immediately jump to something deeper or something else. And I think part of that is because our society is almost like a gotcha society, where you ask what looks like a relatively simple question, and then you answer with a relatively simple answer, and then someone, and this is on social media, this is in the news, this is wherever, someone's going to jump on you for that simple answer saying, oh, if this is your answer, then you mean X, Y, and Z. So we've gotten really good at saying, oh, here's the question, well, here's the X, Y, and Z they're trying to push to. But there's no X, Y, and Z here. It's we're called to love people no matter what sins they're struggling with, and we're called to point them to the identity God gives them more than their own.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think one of the things that probably makes this such a considerable challenge is how well we're able to insulate ourselves from things we don't like. Um, we're going to talk about this a little bit when we get into the self-defense episode too. But as you kind of approach the issues around sexuality and gender, and um, I know people within the synod, people that I respect too, who like jokingly said part of the issues that we've like forgotten how to indoctrinate our kids, um, and like there's truth to that, um, and people
Which is
in,
a good, well, it's a bad thing that we've forgotten that.
yes, and on the flip side, people will push back and say, well, then they're not exposed to anything, they don't know how to operate in the real world. Like that's a very real concern within that whole situation too, because like so much of what we've done as a church to indoctrinate over the last 50 to 100 years has been just shelter, just shelter, 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 and not in a way that like promotes a healthy place to grow, but just like cuts you off from any sort of connection to the real world, to the world around you.
Which,
Which,
for any of you looking at like how do we deal, you interact with the world and then you talk about it with a Christian lens. You
yeah,
don't say
exactly.
don't look at this, you say look at that, now let's talk about it from a faithful perspective.
Yeah, it's um, so frequently we think of the church as a castle that we cower inside, um, rather than the many other helpful examples of an image of the church, like an island that you stand on, but you can see the sea around you of seething storms and waves, and much of it crashing on your own shores. Um, and you have to learn how to deal with the world around you. And I think a lot of the pushback on this particular issue is like if we acknowledge the existence of sins and struggles with sexual sins, we're enabling them. That's the thought process that I think a lot of people are going through. Rather than we live in a world where if we're doing our job to evangelize, to proclaim the gospel to people, those words are going to land on the ears of people who struggle with sexual sins. Heck, there's probably people in our congregation who struggle with sexual sins that have less to do with some of the more like hot button issues around sexual or like homosexuality and gender ideology, and a lot more to do with like, are they being faithful to their spouse? And those we were much more willing to look on either with grace or ignore, which I'm pretty sure in the article
Which
that
is
you quote,
something this article covers. They're like where
yes,
when you look at uh, sex before marriage or people sleeping together before they're married, which is that was a redundant sentence, or divorce or
the
pornography. Like it's almost like we turn the other way or we wink, and it's like I think that might also be part of the issue
yeah,
because this article says, listen, we have to deal with all of this the same way. You have to care just as much about people living together before they're married as you do homosexual activity, marriage, whatever title you want to put on it.
I mean, like there are programs that churches put on with like fun names like porn and pancakes, well, where they'll have honest conversations around. It's actually not that bad a program. You'd be surprised. Um,
Why?
I'm not
I
fully endorsing
it
here,
might be,
but
but like you picked a name
it's a
that is
morning lunch program.
unfortunate.
That's fair. Um, but we don't do the same thing. We don't have like trans ideology and tapas or something. Like,
You are
see,
correct. We do not.
it sounds ridiculous
Yeah,
because
I would argue it sounds better than porn and pancakes.
thank you. Let's do it. Like
I don't know what tapas are though.
it's like the Spanish side dishes. It's like, or not side dishes. Rather than getting a meal with like a main course and a bunch of side courses, it's just all small, like bite-sized dishes that you enjoy throughout an
So
evening.
it's snacks.
Um, More like it's a meal full of something that's somewhere between an hors d'oeuvre and a main course.
So it's snacks.
Yeah, kind of. Um, but yeah, all of that aside, as we address these issues, as we like dive into the cultural phenomena around them, um, we need to be willing to engage them equally as part of our Christian calling and as part of the reality of the sinful world we live in without completely sheltering ourselves from their existence. Um, so, like, for me, the first big, I think, cultural influence that's pushing us to, or has been pushing people and pushing the church more generally away from this kind of article or away from this kind of thing has been fear. We're afraid of the dominant culture. And anything that sounds like the dominant culture, even if it's us addressing it when it comes into our churches, we cower from because we're so terrified of what's going on around us. And that's not helpful. It's not worth it. Um, and and I think that's a lot of what's happening here.
To quote Peter Griffin, things ain't so bad. Like I think if I could say two things to everyone in the church, not just my church, but like in the church period. Number one would be chill. Just chill. Like a lot of this stuff isn't worth getting all upset about. And number two would
Authentic.
be stop stop getting upset about things that you are not connected to at all. And this
Mhm.
I was on a video call with a bunch of other pastors yesterday, and we briefly mentioned this nonsense with the catechism. And we all and there was unilateral agreement with everyone on the call. It was I think all pastors in the LCMS, we should just all get off social media. I think a lot of we were like a lot of problems would be solved if everyone got off of it. Um, and I don't think
I
I
enjoyed
don't
my
think that's
time on
incorrect at
social media
all.
more. I enjoyed my time on social media more when all I followed was sports writers. I made the mistake of following a couple of pastors I like, and now it's just an absolute like dumpster fire.
Yeah. Um, but like going so these people were upset that that this article was quote unquote too soft or whatever. But and these are I think my last things I want to pull from the article, but this is what it says. It says biblical Christianity cannot endorse sexual reassignment surgery. Medicine is rightly used to heal, not to transcend the body. When medical science is invoked to change the sex of an individual, it has overstepped the boundary and now attempts to transcend the givenness of being made male or female. Like it, and then later it says all homosexual activity is sinful, just as all heterosexual activity outside of marriage is sin. Okay, like I don't it's it's right there. It's I wouldn't call that soft unless you say it's soft to say we know that there are sinful people and we seek to reach them with the gospel, which is what, like, if you're not doing that, you're like missing the whole point of what the church is supposed to be.
Mhm.
Um, and,
I want to circle back to something else that you were talking about, actually, and then go down a completely different branch after that. Um, I hope that's okay.
oh yeah,
Okay, good. So one thing that you said is, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember exactly what you said. Um,
I probably don't either, so it's fine.
this may not be for you. Um, and the thing that makes me think about is if you have a small parish in, rural Nebraska, you might not be running into this on a frequent basis. Um, there are parts of this country that vote, considerably one way or the other. There are parts of this country. I was recently in the LCMS Holy Land, otherwise known as Frankenmuth, where the town is 98% LCMS Lutheran. Um, like there are places where the culture is incredibly dominant, and you may not run into these issues very much. Not to say that they won't, but you may not. And so to hear an article like this might sound overly accepting or overly, um, I don't know exactly what the word I'm looking for here is, but
Well, the question for
hands off.
someone who doesn't interact with it is going to be why? Why don't we just say it's bad and move on? And
Yeah.
to that, if I can
And then,
address that, because there are people
I
like
mean,
me who actually deal with this. We can't just say it's bad and move on, because I have people in my life, in my ministry, where my church is, who struggle with some of
mhm,
this stuff. And I can't just tell them it's bad, move on. It is my
yeah,
call as a pastor to love them, to say, I love you, I care about you because you are a baptized child of God. What you're doing is wrong,
mhm,
but that doesn't stop the fact that that's something I have to deal with, and I have had to deal with since being out here. So even if your church never
yeah.
comes across it, this is your testimonial right now that there is a faithful Lutheran church that has to deal with this stuff.
I grew up in the city of Minneapolis, in the
I'm
city
sorry.
of Minneapolis, which is, hey, it's a beautiful place. Um, don't knock until you try it. I know you'd freeze to death up there.
I would. I would.
Don't knock until you try. But I think while I was growing up, at some point, Minneapolis was like the second or third gayest city in America by statistical population numbers. Um, and if I were to roll around with um, like homosexuality is a sin, repent and believe, like printed on a shirt, there's a decent chance I would have gotten beat up in Minneapolis. But you know what else exists in Minneapolis? Half a dozen LCMS congregations. They exist. They're doing good work. They're serving and loving their neighbors. They're encountering these issues on a daily basis. As they walk down the street and see, pride flags and trans rights flags and all these things uh, plastered on homes or in their neighborhoods. This may not be for you. This might be for the pastors in Minneapolis. This might be for pastors like Josh in SoCal. This, I mean, I've run into a little bit here in Lake Orion, Michigan, which is a fairly conservative place, theologically and politically. Um, this just may not be for you. And remember that there are people and pastors and congregations in different contexts that may need this word, that may need this teaching, that may need this help, that aren't you. So that's one. Now to diverge down a completely different path.
Squirrel.
Yes, squirrel. One of the reasons that we engage in the world and one of the reasons that we engage with the world is so that we make sure that our understanding and wisdom um, exists in the world, and especially on this issue. Um, this morning, I read an article that I found thanks to friend of the show, Hayden Lucas. Um, shout out to Hayden. Um, and he posted an article about a former um, intake worker at the uh, transgender something at St. Louis Children's Hospital. Um, it was like their gender care department, basically. Um, and she left because she felt like culture was pushing things too far, too hard. She was starting to be exposed to kids that she felt were struggling with all sorts of other things, and the immediate answer was like they mentioned once that gender was an issue. And the immediate answer was, well, reassign their gender. They must not be the gender that they were born at birth because they've expressed any doubt about it. And that told me two things. One, it's good that there are people willing to vocally put out there that, hey, we love you, but we don't think this is right. That's a lot more like as a voice to engage with, that's a lot more friendly than uh you heathens uh stop it. Um but two, I think the reality is we live in a broken enough world where we're going to start to run into a lot of people who regret some of the decisions they make around their gender and sexuality. And a lot of these things have real medical and lifelong impacts. And some of these people might wander into our churches looking for an answer in the midst of a lot of hopelessness. Things like this help us to be prepared. And again, you may not run into this. This may not be for you. But the reality is that culture is shifting. We can't ignore it. We can't run from it. We can't hide from it. We need to be prepared to embrace those who've been hurt by it, especially those who've been in that culture, been of that culture, and now are ready to flee from it. Or may not even be ready to flee from it, but know that they've experienced trauma and hurt because of it and are just looking for a place of refuge.
And if Ben's wise words aren't enough for you, Jesus instructs his disciples to be in the world but not of the world. Like, and shoot, I forget what I was. I think this is actually in the Book of Concord. No, maybe it's in the Small Catechism. I don't. It's in one of our confessional documents. But the idea is like, if you're going to avoid coming in contact with people who are sinful or coming in contact with sin or temptations, um, you have to leave the world. Like we're not called to go cloister ourselves off and not talk to any, like Are people going to do things that they shouldn't all the freaking time?
Hmm.
That should be an encouragement for us to interact with them. And also like an opportunity for us to be honest and admit that like we also do things all the time that we shouldn't. And we failed it. Like a core part of our confession is that we are simul justus et peccator. We are simultaneously saints and sinners because we constantly fall short of God's will and we're constantly in his forgiveness. So for us to say someone's sin is too far, it's like, no, there's no limit to God's grace. So we step into these situations and we deal with people. And this is this
This past weekend,
go for it.
this past weekend, I preached on a text from Isaiah. If you were in the lectionary, then you might. Um, but the text is around improper fasting that the people are doing on the Day of Atonement, and God's whole purpose with that, with their fasting, was that all of the people would be in the same state, hungry, in need of His provision, and they screwed that whole thing up. And we kind of ignore that idea in in worship sometimes. We don't let that form us, that we all stand at confession and say, I confess that I have sinned. And we say it out loud so that our neighbors hear us. We all stand in the same need of God's grace. And if we're not ready and prepared to offer that to people in every situation, we're suddenly placing ourselves above others in that regard. They have things to work on? Yes. Josh and I won't deny that. But so do the rest of us. So let's be prepared to come with a little humility, to come with some patience, to come with the grace of God. And we'll work on sprinkling in the law when and where we can. And salt bay it.
You know, a steak at that place costs like $5,000.
Only if you get it gold plated. I think the regular ones are like
Ridiculous.
500. Yeah. No,
Only 500.
it's
Stupid.
wildly and stupidly overly priced. Yes. I understand.
In any case, I think it's a time for takeaways. I'm gonna go for it with my takeaway, and I'm just gonna say, if you're really upset about this publication, stop it. That's dumb. Don't. It was fine. It is fine.
A nice knock it off from Josh there. I'm gonna go with
Yes, stop it.
don't buy steak from Salt Bay's restaurant.
Hey, the man has to make a living, okay?
Yeah, but he could do it in a less like obviously uh like rip-offy and scammy kind of way. Anyway, um it's like Applebee's on steroids. It has like the air of fine dining, but it's just not not that at all.
So for
Anyway,
$500, you could buy an Applebee's.
honestly, at this point, maybe. At this point, maybe. Um, I think my actual takeaway here is, as you read and encounter things that churches and publishing houses and um, seminaries and whoever else may put out, recognize your place in the world and recognize that there are other audiences, and not every work may perfectly pertain to your situation, your context. And if you find problems with something, take them directly to the author of that thing and ask questions before you bring
Blog about it.
your content. Because like oftentimes they'll have a perfectly reasonable and well thought out explanation for why they worded things the way they did, why they wrote what they did. Uh, if you just ask those questions, you might get a good answer. And it's going to be a lot better answer than the angry one that they're going to write you when you yell at the world about it.
There we go. And for any other questions on Ben's takeaway, see season 1, episode 1.
Yeah.
If you know anyone who was upset by this controversy for whatever reason, send them this podcast. Water on the fire.
I mean, we're probably going to put some gas on the fire, but that's okay.
Yeah. And if at any point during this podcast you thought this would be good for someone to hear, go ahead and send them a link, text them a link, and they can do that. Also, for yourself and for your loved ones, subscribe. We'd love for the whole family to subscribe. It would validate our time here. And we're on all the major podcasting platforms. That's Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. And I think Tune In, something, I don't know. Subscribe, and we have a Facebook page that if you want to reach out to us, if you have questions, comments, you want us to do a topic, you want us to invite a guest, you want to be a guest, any of those things, but you don't know us personally, you can reach out to the Facebook page. We will see it eventually. If you know us personally, you can just shoot us a text. That will suffice. So, with that, those are our shameless plugs for the day. Oh, and let's go ahead and throw one in. Check out CPH. They have a lot of good stuff. And it keeps getting better. The new guy that does curriculum over there does a really good job with stuff. So, with that, brothers and sisters, go in peace. Serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.